Plants. We all love them, or at least you should, because without all of this here, we wouldn't even exist. So yeah, plants are important, and you may be here because you wish that you could identify them. You wish that you could tell one plant from another. For example, this tree here and this one here. Two separate species, but how do you tell them apart? Well, that's my plan for this series. I'm going to be breaking down the key concepts for plant identification into kind of short little bite-sized chunks for you here on YouTube. So stick around if that's what you're interested in. To identify a plant, you need to be able to describe different parts of that plant. But first of all, how do you describe a part of a plant if you don't know what that part is in the first place? So this first tutorial is going to be describing what the different parts of a plant are in general before we start describing how those parts look. So first of all, we're going to start nice and broad with some terminology that you've all heard before. So behind me here we have a tree. This is a puriri tree, Vitex lucens, and starting at the bottom here we have the trunk. So we've all heard that word before, and as that trunk goes upwards it starts to branch out into branches, that's right. And the branches lead up into the canopy, which is made up of leaves. So those are all words that you've heard, but that isn't all that there is to a plant or a tree. So obviously we also have the bits that are hidden from sight most of the time, and those are the roots that are buried underground. And also another part of a plant that is super important for plant identification is the flowers and fruit as well. At least if you're looking at a flowering plant. If you're looking at a conifer, it's going to be the cones. If you're looking at a fern, it's going to be the sporangia, which are usually on the undersides of the fern fronds. So lots to keep in mind here, but we are going to start out just looking at the vegetative characteristics. So we're going to be ignoring flowers for now, because flowers are a little bit more complex. We're going to make it nice and simple, ease you into this process of learning how to identify plants, starting with the leaves. But first of all, leaves are made up of more than just one word. They're not just a leaf. If you look at different parts of the leaf, you've actually got different terminologies to describe different parts of that leaf. So we're going to now zoom in on a set of leaves, or even the stems as well, and we're going to try and give names to these different parts. Let's do it. Okay, so the species that I've chosen to have as an example for zooming in on the leaves is kawakawa, which is Piper excelsum. I've specifically chosen kawakawa because it does have very obvious characteristics along the stem that make this explanation a little bit easier for newcomers. So first thing you may notice on the stem itself is that we have these kind of little lumps at varying intervals along the stem, and these are what we call nodes. And nodes are the only points along a stem where new growth can occur. So new growth could be new branches, or it could be leaves or flowers. The key thing here is that it's only growing from nodes. So these lumps here are the only points where new growth can occur. Anywhere in between the nodes, no new growth can occur usually. So this area between the nodes is called the internode. So it's in between nodes. Just keep in mind that not all species have very obvious prominent nodes where it's actually bulging a bit like this. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle, so you just need to kind of take note of where new growth is occurring, and that is usually a pretty good indicator of where the node is. Okay, now that we have the stem characteristics out of the way, we're going to move along to the leaf. But first of all, what attaches the leaf to the stem? So growing out from the node here, we have a leaf stalk, which is actually called a petiole, just the stalk bit itself. You may notice this kind of funny leaf-like looking structure here at the base of the petiole. That isn't very common in many plants. It's kind of a monocot thing. This is called a profil. Again, you probably won't come across these too often. It's pretty distinctive of kawakawa, but most of the time it'll just be a straight kind of stalk from the node all the way out to the leaf without this funny looking profil thing. Okay, so we're going to focus on the leaf itself now. So we'll use this one here. And now you may just say that's a leaf, but we do need to be able to describe different parts of this leaf. Therefore, we need to give the different parts of the leaf different names. So for example, the base of the leaf up here is called the base. So that's pretty straightforward. The base is closest to where the petiole attaches to the base. So this kind of entire edge around this part of the leaf is the base. On the other side, at the very far end of the leaf, the very point, we call that the apex. So kind of this section of the leaf. It's kind of a little bit subjective how much of it you kind of call the apex, but we give different descriptions to kind of different shaped apexes and also different shaped bases. But we'll get into what those different descriptions are in future videos. Next up, we have the leaf veins. So you can see that there's some very prominent veins, and these are what we call the primary veins, sometimes also called the costa, which is the, I don't know if it's Latin or Greek word for ribs, so kind of the leaf ribs. So kawakawa has a few leaf ribs, whereas a more typical shaped leaf, you may have that single mid-rib down the middle and then the smaller veins branching off it. So that's something else that we're going to go over in a future video, is describing the different types of what we call venation. So just take note for now that we've got the primary veins, or the costa. Sometimes we can call it a mid-rib if it is just a single rib down the center. But again, with kawakawa, we've got multiple ribs, so we can't technically call it a mid-rib. But if we look even closer, I'll see if I can zoom in on this. I don't know if I can capture that on video, it's a little bit tricky. But we've got lots of tiny little veins as well that kind of branch out in between these more prominent veins. And those are what we call venules. So kind of just tiny little veins that branch out into the rest of the leaf. Now, what do we call the rest of the leaf? So this entire kind of green leaf blade, sometimes it is called a leaf blade, but botanists will also sometimes call it the lamina. So that's another word for you there, the lamina of the leaf. And finally, the edge of the leaf is what we call the margin. Now this is important to keep in mind because often the margin of a leaf is very important for diagnosing a species. For example, it can be nice and smooth like this, or it can be serrated or toothed or whatnot. Again, we'll get into that in a future video. Okay, so one more piece of terminology here. I am holding Coprosma macrocarpa, and you can see at the base of the petioles where they attach to the node, all words that you should know by now, there are these other two little spikes, one on each side of the stem. These spikes are called stipules, and we can sometimes refer to them as leaf-like structures. So they're not actual leaves, but they're leaf-like, or at least in some other species they are. In Coprosma species they do look kind of like a little tooth-looking thing, but they can sometimes look more like a leaf. Stipules tend to grow kind of around a young leaf bud, and they're there to kind of protect the bud as it grows. As you can see here, the bud has continued to grow. It's formed the leaves out to each side, and it's also continued the stem upwards as well, but the stipules have remained present even though they've finished their job. They're no longer needed, but sometimes they do just hang around. And yeah, so these stipules can be very diagnostic of the species, particularly in Coprosma. They're very useful for differentiating different Coprosma species, especially this Coprosma macrocarpa, which just about looks exactly like Coprosma robusta if you do not look at the stipules. Well, there you have it. That is part one of this plant identification series done and dusted. You now know the fancy terminology for all those different parts of a plant. My next videos are going to focus one-on-one on each of those individual parts that I've introduced you to in this video, and we're going to learn how to actually describe them next. So looking at shape, size, color, texture even. I look forward to taking you on this journey with me. I'll see you in the next one.